Hi everyone, let's talk about visual design. As multimedia developers, we're expected to design learning objects that look awesome. But what does that really mean? And what distinguishes a good design from a bad design? Because we see bad designs all the time. Think about all those horrible PowerPoints that we've seen, either as a student or we've seen at conferences or other colleagues develop. Maybe we've made them ourselves. You know the ones I'm talking about. They might look like this. A bunch of bullet points with text that goes all the way across the screen and a color pattern that's very hard to read. And what does the speaker end up doing? They end up looking at it and reading the whole time. Not effective, and one of the reasons death by PowerPoint has become a horrible cliche. The truth is, PowerPoint is an amazing authoring tool. We just don't use it very well. And of course, we also see bad poster designs all the time. We only have to go look at the bulletin board down the hall to see this. You'll see too much information, again, jammed into one poster, too much text, too many fonts, not a very consistent color scheme, no real pattern to the way all of the information is arranged on the page, so the eye has no idea where to begin or where to end. And of course, don't forget our newsletters. All those newsletters that we send to our student households, a lot of times those have too much information on them as well, and poor color schemes, and inconsistent font selections and typefaces, and no real alignment strategy. These look terrible, and yet we use them and see them all the time. And don't forget the informational flyers that we might see or that we might develop ourselves as well. Flyers especially are prone to having way too much information on them and no real design strategy. Well, here's the good news. Thankfully, visual design is a process that can be taught. And perhaps no designer is more famous for demystifying the voodoo of design than Robin Williams. You remember her? Remember her CRAP principles? This is her book, the latest edition. Well, her CRAP principles are a fantastic way for non-professionals to understand the basics of good design. We're going to look at each of these principles in detail and look at a lot of examples. You remember these: contrast, repetition, alignment, proximity. A basic understanding of these simple principles will help you as a multimedia developer make much better visual designs in the documents and projects and learning objects that you create. So let's start with the first one. Let's jump right into contrast. The principle of contrast states very simply that elements that are different should be very different. What does that really mean? Well, it means don't be wishy-washy in your designs. Elements, by the way, they can be anything on the design. They can be shapes, they can be text, they can be photos, as well as their stylistic attributes. It could be color, it could be size, it could be positioning. All of these can be used to create or diminish contrast. And this simple principle is trying to emphasize that if you're going to make something different, you have to make it really, really different. Otherwise, the elements are too ambiguous, especially if they're positioned right next to each other. That these differences have to be distinct. So let's take a look at some examples. When you look at this one right here, the very first thing that captures your eyeball most likely is this light bulb. And that's certainly deliberate. It's very large, so the size of that element is bigger than the element on this side. So the light bulb then is the dominant element, and that creates weight within the design. So the left side of this design is probably heavier than the right side of the design. We'll talk about this later, but we're not trying to make symmetry here. We're trying to make balance. So we have the text elements here somewhat sizable, but they're not quite as big. And look at the size of the text as well. You have two different versions of the text here. Emphasizes and difference are larger as well. And that's deliberate also. The contrast between the font typefaces, the size, is deliberate because the whole point of this particular slide, or at least this design, is that difference needs to be emphasized. And that's why all four of these lines are not the same typeface. The words that are more important have a contrasting design. How many times have you seen a PowerPoint slide that has a lot of text information sitting on top of an appropriate graphic? Well, a very simple technique to increase the contrast of the text from the background image is to put a mask underneath it. And by mask, I simply mean a rectangle. In this case, do you see this purple rectangle? All that is just a shape that's layered underneath this text element and assigned a little bit of opacity. And that way the opacity allows a little bit of the image to shine through, so you still have some of the thematic continuity in the design. But the darker color in this case behind the lighter colored text makes it much easier to read. And of course you notice the size difference as well. The subtext here is much smaller because the title text is the most important element, and that's what's designed to grab the attention. So notice how different the sizes are. Really big font text and then much smaller. Again, the key is if you're going to be different, be very different. Here's another example. Again, we have very large text elements right there in the middle. Listening to wine. Okay, in this event flyer, you have some large text in the middle that immediately grabs the eyeball. You also have this very large graphic with this brilliant use of white as a color, and it's laid out in this vertical orientation here. And what that does is it draws the eye down next. After you see the title, Listening to Wine, this color here vertically pulls the eye down to the next largest text element, which is the date that this event is going to happen. This is all deliberate. This is good design. You want to guide the eye across the design. So not only do you have a dominant text element, you also have a hierarchy to the way the text is displayed. You have the largest item right here, then the second largest, and that pulls the eye downward. You also have a punch out down here, or a cutout, or a call out, sometimes they're labeled. This is down at the bottom, again, to add gravity to the design, to pull the eye downward so that hopefully you see this. So it's very well designed here. Now, how many times have you seen a PowerPoint or other digital document that has text colored so similar to the background that it's tough to distinguish them? This is a very weak contrast, wimpy, wishy-washy contrast, and not what we want. Over here on the right-hand side, even though key lime green is probably not the most popular design color, with black, strongly contrasting text, it's a fantastic color, and this is very legible. So again, if you're going to be different, make your elements very different. Let's move on to repetition. Here's the principle. Some elements or element attributes should be repeated throughout the design. Let's take a look at some examples. In this flyer, what's being repeated here? It's very simple to see that you've got some colors that are being repeated. And obviously this helps establish the color theme, which is part of a strategy or one of the development strategies that you can use to establish document unity. After all, that's really the goal of repetition, is to help unify the document. So what's being repeated here in this design? Well, if you look carefully, you've got some shades of purple, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4, but they're all part of the purple family, and you can see them repeated up here in these birds. You also have yellow and this orange shade repeated as well. But the point is, there are only really 2 colors that are being repeated here. You have a yellowish orange and then a shade of purple. So that simplifies the document, makes this much more unified in design. You also have shapes repeating them. I guess we have this ram shape that's duplicated. We have bird shapes that are duplicated. And in a very simple design like this, it does a lot to create what we call document unity. Why is that important? Why is document unity critical? Well, it reduces cognitive processing. Let's take a look at another example here. There's a lot more information in this design. Again, we have colors repeated. You have gold repeated, and you have this fuchsia looking color repeated, and the blues are repeated. But notice how the colors are used as backgrounds, and they're also used as font colors for some of the subtext here. And that's essential as well. And if you look really close, you can see that the header styles for the title text objects, those are repeated. The actual typefaces are repeated. Why is this important? Well, as the eye scans the page, we don't want to have to struggle trying to look at too many different fonts, too many different colors. if you repeat a convention or an attribute, such as a typeface, it establishes very quickly to the brain that this element is in the same class as these other elements, and it facilitates the cognitive processing substantially. In other words, you know what a subheading is supposed to mean. And so if you have the same color scheme used for each subheading, that means they're related, and you don't have to invest as much mental energy as you scan the page. Same with positioning. If you look carefully at these subheadings, they're all positioned appropriately on the left-hand side of the columned text. Here's a real neat and subtle use of repetition. I want you to take a very close look at these feathers. Are they really feathers? No, not at all. You should see some hands, as in the hands of a dancer. And obviously, when they're repeated one on top of each other with this custom color scheme that's also repeated, the red and the black, also pulling from the beak here in the swan, it gives the illusion that these are actually feathers when they're really hands. Very subtle. But here's something else that's even more subtle that's repeated in this document. Look at the angle here on the backside of the swan, the backside of these feather hands. That's the angle here. Notice that that angle continues up here, and you have this staggered step. The K here sticks out to the right, the N sticks just a little bit to the left of that, and then this text here does the same thing, in the same way that you have this staggered staircase design with the back feathers, or these hands on the swan. So a very subtle and a very artistic way to use repetition, again, to unify a document. What's neat about this particular design is the use of organic color. And by organic, I mean when you have a photo that has a dominant color or a dominant hue, like in these sunglasses, sometimes it's very clever and very appropriate to pull out a couple shades of these colors and use them in other elements, like in this call out right here underneath Relic Eyewear, which I assume this is part of their logo, or maybe that's their logo over here. But either way, you have that color repeated. And then you have other shades, such as the faint yellowish hue here, almost looks skin tone. That's pulled out of the glasses as well. So you have a dominant orange color here to create contrast, and then you have a more subtle background flesh tone color here also pulled from the glasses. This is organic design, and it's a very common strategy used when you're trying to establish a color scheme for a particular piece. Now, what else is repeated in this design? Well, you should see some stars. So you have shapes that are being repeated, lots of stars in the design. And of course, the alignments and the shapes here are repeated. So we have a rectangle here that holds that set of sunglasses. We have a background rectangle here and a background rectangle here. So we've repeated the exact shape there. The colors are slightly different shades or hues of the header and footer colors, which is this teal kind of color down here. But it's a nice use of repetition, but the key concept I want to draw your attention to is this use of organic color. Okay, let's move on to alignment. Here's what the principle says. Every element should connect visually with another. Now, don't be misled. We're not necessarily drawing lines between all these different objects. Many times these lines are completely invisible. Here's what we mean. The whole point behind this is that nothing on the design is placed arbitrarily. And we're not trying to create symmetry here. We're trying to create balance. So let's take a look at some examples here and you'll see what I mean. First of all, with shapes, graphics, images, you really have a couple options for aligning them. You have what we call baseline alignment, which is what you see up here in the top, where you take an edge, such as the bottom edge of each of these graphics, and you align them to a vertical line. And that line can either be drawn or it can be invisible. But the point is, to the pixel, these elements are lined up. Now you can also align them along a center line, which is what you see in the bottom. And more than likely that will not be a visible line, that will be invisible. But to the pixel, these elements need to be aligned. When you scatter them, you create more cognitive processing. It takes more energy to read or to glance or to skim or scan graphic elements when they're scattered on the page. So let's look at some designs here and you'll see what I mean. Start with something really simple. Now this isn't a horrible design here. This on the left-hand side. This actually looks pretty good. We have this nice left edge over here for the title text and the subtext. And then you have some additional detail text down here at the bottom, but notice that it's centered. We love to center everything in designs. Too much. The problem with having this text centered is that it's orphaned. Everything else has this nice left alignment. Does that mean we have to put it over here on the left? No. It just means that there's no unity between these two elements. We also have this large amount of space between them. So what's a clever way that we could unify these elements without disrupting the overall design too much? Take a look at the right-hand side. What have we done differently? Two things. We've put this horizontal rule here, which is nothing more than the desktop publishing term for a line. And we've terminated that line over here on the right-hand side with, it looks like 30 or so pixels of empty space. And then we've terminated it right on the right-hand justified edge of this text. So we took this text element and changed it from centered and now made it right aligned. And that allows us then to connect this element with that element. So what does that mean? That means the document here on the right now is unified. All the elements connect, at least invisibly. And that's the goal of good design as far as the principle of alignment is concerned. Here's another example. Look on the left-hand side here. This is what we do all the time. And this is not good design. We center everything. We're obsessed with centering text. And that is very tedious for the eye to read. So what have we done differently over here on the right-hand side? We've done two things. One, we've left aligned everything, so there's this nice vertical direction that we know we need to head as we scan the page. And we've also grouped some of these elements. And we'll talk about grouping shortly here with the principle of proximity. But a simple shift to the left here creates this nice vertical direction that the eye will travel down. And we've also added some weight to the bottom of the page with this graphic. We made it a little bit bigger and stuck it down here. Again, the whole point is to reinforce the eye movement downward. Take a look at this website. Where do you see subtle but important aspects of alignment? Well, you should see them on some of these edges. When we have so many different vertical and horizontal lines here, it's critical that they line up. So take the header for example. We've got this nice hard edge right here, and it lines up also with the edge of this sidebar, as does the right-hand side to the pixel. This is invisibly connected. Take a look in between these. You have a gutter here and then a gutter over here. That gap is also equidistant. Now they didn't justify the text here, the body text, which is kind of interesting because it creates the illusion that this one is actually wider than this gutter over here. But if you count the pixels, they really are identical. And you have the same width over here and the same width over here. All this consistency in the alignment strategy makes it easier to scan. So that is one of the goals, is to reduce the amount, again, to reduce the amount of cognitive processing that's required as you look at this particular design. Here's another example. In this case, we've got an invoice. Who knew that an invoice could look so elegant? Now obviously we've got the principle of contrast in play here with this wonderful header and the bold color and the large size here. Again, if you're going to be different, be very different. But look at the alignment of the body text here. In this case, it's mostly numbers because it is an invoice. You've got lots of gutters here, and they're used consistently throughout the design. You also have this gutter right here, this left-aligned text here, lining up with the other side of this column of text in the actual invoice section. So this is really important. You take advantage of organic edges. In this case, this text right here, this is an organic edge once it becomes left-aligned, and then you repeat that down here by using the same alignment strategy. Notice that this line right here down in the footer between thank you and the body text to the left, that line right there aligns with the edge in the header. So everything, again, everything is connected invisibly here. And this helps not only reduce cognitive processing, but it also creates document unity. Let's move on to proximity. Here's what the principle says. Group related items together to reduce overload, cognitive overload, that is. Well, and this is pretty intuitive. I think this is probably one of the easiest principles to understand. But let's take a look at some of the examples. The whole trick here, all we're simply trying to do is to reduce the amount of processing in short-term memory that's required to scan a page. Remember, when we read, we don't necessarily read every single word. The eye scans ahead and scans down, at least in our culture. In some Asian cultures, they scan in different directions, obviously. But the point is, the eye moves very, very quickly across the document. So anything you can do to reduce the number of discrete elements on the page by grouping them makes it easier to scan. Remember, short-term memory, we can only process 7 plus or minus 2 elements at the same time. That's what the research in cognitive load has told us for decades. So let's take a look at some examples here and see if we can figure this out. First one, here's a business card. And you've got how many discrete elements on the page? Well, you've got this big pink text at the top, some subtext, you've got this image that's muted in the background, then you have a phone number, an email, and then some address over here. Okay, well discretely there are 6 or 7 elements there, but when we group them, we've essentially dropped that number to 4. 1, 2, 3, and then the picture is the 4th one. But the picture is so muted, its weight is diminished, so it effectively becomes only 3 main elements. The most bold is obviously the title element, which is the most important for a business card anyway, because of the branding value associated with that. So grouping then allows you to create designs that are really easy to understand in a microsecond. Why? Because it doesn't take a whole lot of processing to scan 3 elements. We know, based on the blocks and based on our prior knowledge, that this is probably going to be contact info and this is probably going to be an address. And obviously this we understand to be a title. So in a very brief amount of time here, microseconds, we have a very good understanding of what this business card looks like. So here's another one. In this one here, what have we grouped? Well, we don't have many elements here, but we have a title element, and then we have the body text down here, and then we have this graphic in the background with a shape, and I'm assuming that this red shape here is supposed to symbolize the sun of some kind. And notice how those two are paired up, and then the text is paired up. So instead of having 4 discrete elements in this design, we only have 2. We have a combined shape, and then we have a combined text element. And then we have all this white space over here on the right-hand side. What does that white space do in this design? Well, in this design, it creates gravity. It pulls the design downward. And it's very, very effective. It doesn't take a lot of processing to realize, whoa, Eiffel Tower, France, that must be Paris. And then there's some detail text. It's a very elegant design setup here. We see this a lot in movie posters as well. Movie posters are really, really good at using grouping, at obeying the principle of proximity to make the posters easier to understand. Because remember, in movie posters, they almost all have this boring stuff down here at the bottom. I probably shouldn't say boring. If I offended you, I'm sorry. But there's detailed text here that we don't necessarily read, if at all. And for that reason, they stick it down at the bottom, and they don't give it a whole lot of contrast. What does have contrast is usually the title and then whatever the key graphic is. And this is such a cool design here. When we first look at this, what do you see? Most people, I think, would argue that they see the very middle here, where they're climbing, right here in between the 2 rocks. And from there, it's kind of neat because the design, all this empty white space right here, either pushes you up to see the subtitle or takes you down to see the title. So why is this significant? Well, all of these elements could have been lumped together and the eye wouldn't know where to move. But in this case, we begin right in the middle. That's our focal point, and then we either drop down or we go up to see the other combined elements. Very, very attractive use of the principle of proximity. Let's talk about white space, because white space is a critical construct to understand for designers. In general, most novice designers don't use enough white space. White space helps create eye movement. It helps with balancing a page. It can create weight on one side or another. It can shift that weight around. And many times we don't use enough white space. Instead, we feel compelled as instructors to dump as much information on the slide or the page as we can. And that is not good design because it exceeds the capacity of human short-term memory processing. So as you think about the learning objects that you create, don't overdo it, whether it's a page, a document, a screen. Don't put too much content on there. Use white space intelligently, and remember that white space can guide eye movement. Here's a perfect example. I don't know how many websites you've been paying attention to lately, but you see full screen graphics a lot more often now. And even though this is a photo in the background on this website, the area above it, right here, and to the sides, and then down below it, this is all white space. And the text here, honest folks, is contrasted enough and large enough and it's bold enough so that it does pop out from the background graphic. It's very easy to read. Notice the use, however, again, principle of contrast. Up here at the top, you've got this rectangle, this very light shaded rectangle that's underneath the text elements, the actual menus here, and it's got some transparency assigned to it to give it contrast so that we can actually read the menu items. Very subtly designed. But as far as the principle of proximity is concerned, you have the most important stuff here in the middle all grouped together, and then you have your menu items all grouped together, and then you have a tremendous amount of white space here. And the white space obviously allows the image to speak for whatever the content is, and that's very, very deliberate in this particular design. Here's another website that makes excellent use of white space and has grouped the elements accordingly. You have the masthead here up top. Notice that it's all contained virtually within this big white rectangle. Then you have this key photo here with nothing really on top of it other than this masked piece of text. So the photo here acts as a divider between the header and the footer. And then in the footer here you have some body text on the right grouped together, and then you have some body text on the left right here grouped together. So how many discrete elements do you have on the page? Really, you could say the header is one, the middle, the body of the page here with a photo is another, including this piece of text, and then you have a footer here. So again, the whole point is to try to reduce the amount of cognitive processing that's required when you scan the page. Grouping is a great strategy for doing that. Now clearly, we are just scratching the surface. The study of visual design can be much more comprehensive. I mean, after all, there are entire degree programs, MFA programs, that will allow you to study to be a professional graphic designer. But for people like us, for multimedia developers, these 4 CRAP principles, I promise, will help you build learning objects that not only look great, but they also improve cognition. Because let's face it, good visual design reinforces good instructional design. And we'll learn all about that synergy when we examine multimedia learning theory in the next module. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you online.